The sound of a shotgun blast echoed across the dusty plains of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado, as Margaret Vance watched the last of her possessions go up in smoke. It was 1878, and her husband of 8 years had set fire to their barn before riding off with another woman, leaving Margaret with nothing but the clothes on her back and a deed to a property now worth less than the paper it was written on. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly as Margaret stood among the smoldering ruins of what had once been her life. At 26, she had the calloused hands of someone twice her age, earned from years of thankless work on a homestead that her husband Jasper had gambled away piece by piece. The last straw had been when he'd lost their cattle herd in a poker game to the owner of the saloon in town. "Worthless piece of land now," Jasper had spat before mounting his horse. "Good luck surviving the winter, Maggie. Maybe you can sell yourself to the miners passing through." His cruel laughter had followed him down the trail, as Margaret stood frozen in disbelief. Now, 3 days later, the reality of her situation was sinking in. The pantry held enough food for perhaps 2 weeks if she rationed carefully. The well was still functioning, but without livestock or seed for crops, she had no sustainable way forward. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and she had no horse to get there. Margaret kicked at the charred remains of a wagon wheel, tears of frustration streaking through the soot on her face. She'd come west as a bride full of hope, leaving behind her family in Pennsylvania. Now, she was alone with nothing. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. Someone was approaching on horseback. For a wild moment, she thought Jasper might have returned, but she quickly dismissed the notion. Her husband wasn't the type to have second thoughts about abandoning his responsibilities. As the rider drew closer, Margaret reached for her father's old rifle that she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in the cabin. It was the one thing Jasper hadn't found to sell. She checked that it was loaded and stepped out onto the porch, the weapon held ready but not aimed directly at the stranger. The man who approached was tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His dark hair was partially hidden beneath a well-worn Stetson, and a few days' worth of stubble covered his jawline. His clothes were dusty, but of good quality, and the horse he rode was a magnificent chestnut stallion that spoke of careful breeding. "Madam," he called, raising his hand in greeting as he drew his horse to a stop, a respectful distance from the cabin. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw the smoke from a ways back. Everything all right here?" Margaret kept the rifle visible. "Nothing's all right, but there's no danger to anyone passing through. You can be on your way." The stranger's eyes, a striking green that stood out against his sun-darkened skin, took in the burned barn, the empty corral, and Margaret's disheveled appearance. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a flicker of sympathy that Margaret found almost unbearable. "Name's Kieran Lawson," he said, removing his hat. "I'm the new foreman at the R Ranch about 10 miles east. Was on my way to Cottonwood Springs for supplies when I saw the smoke." He hesitated before adding, "Looks like you could use some help, madam." "I don't need charity," Margaret said, even as her voice cracked with the lie. Kieran dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. "Not offering charity, just neighborly assistance." He glanced around again. "Your husband around?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "My husband left me with nothing 3 days ago. Burned the barn on his way out for good measure." Kieran's expression hardened. "That's more than he ever gave me." Margaret lowered the rifle slightly. "You know Jasper?" "Jasper Vance?" When she nodded, Kieran's mouth tightened into a grim line. "I know him. He owes money to half the territory, including me. Won $100 off me in a rigged card game last spring in Denver." Margaret felt a fresh wave of shame. "Seems I'm the only fool who didn't know what kind of man he was until it was too late." Kieran shook his head. "No shame in trusting the man you married, madam." He looked around at the devastation again. "Do you have somewhere to go? Family nearby?" "No family west of the Mississippi," Margaret said. "And it's Margaret Vance, though I'll be shedding that name as soon as possible." "Margaret," Kieran acknowledged with a slight nod. "Well, I can't leave you out here alone with no food or protection. The R has a small cabin for guests. You'd be welcome to stay there until you get back on your feet." Margaret's pride warred with her practical nature. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Kieran said simply. "I know what it's like to be left with nothing." His eyes held hers steadily. and I know what kind of man leaves his wife to die on the frontier." The sincerity in his voice finally broke through Margaret's defenses. She looked around at the ruins of her life and made a decision. "Let me gather what little I have left." Within the hour, Margaret had packed her few remaining possessions, some clothes, her mother's Bible, a locket with her parents' portraits, and a small tin of coffee beans that had been overlooked in the back of a cupboard. Kieran helped her secure the cabin as best they could, though there was little of value left to protect. As they set out toward the Triple R, Margaret riding behind Kieran on his horse, she felt a strange mixture of despair and hope. The warmth of the stranger's back against her chest and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them lulled her into a state of exhausted calm. "Why did you really stop?" she asked, after they'd been riding for some time. Most men would have kept going. Kieran was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and colored with old pain. 10 years ago, I came home to find my wife and infant son dead from smallpox. Neighbors had abandoned them, afraid of catching the disease." He paused. "I know what it's like to face the world alone when everything you love is gone. No one should have to do that." Margaret's arms, loosely circling his waist for balance, tightened briefly in an instinctive gesture of comfort. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago," Kieran said. But the tension in his shoulders told a different story. As they crested a hill, the Triple R spread out before them, a sprawling ranch with a large main house, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the cowhands, and extensive corrals filled with cattle and horses. In the distance, cowboys were driving a small herd toward fresh grazing land. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, genuinely impressed by the well-maintained property. "Mr. Randall runs a tight operation," Kieran agreed. "He's a fair man who built this place from nothing after the war. Started with just 20 head of cattle and now has one of the largest spreads in the territory." They rode directly to a small but well-built cabin situated a short distance from the main house. It had its own small corral and shed, and a neat vegetable garden grew alongside it. "This was the original homestead before Mr. Randall built the big house," Kieran explained as he helped Margaret dismount. "It's used for guests now, but no one's staying at present." The inside of the cabin was simple but clean, with a small kitchen area, a living space with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom separated by a curtain. It was more comfortable than the homestead Margaret had shared with Jasper for the past 8 years. "I'll have Mrs. Fletcher bring you some food from the main house," Kieran said, lingering by the door. "She's the cook and housekeeper, and I'll let Mr. Randall know you're here." "Will he mind?" Margaret asked, suddenly worried. "I don't want to cause trouble." Kieran's smile was reassuring. "Robert Randall doesn't turn away folks in need. Rest now. We can talk about what comes next when you've had a chance to catch your breath." After he left, Margaret sank onto the small bed and finally allowed herself to weep for the years wasted with Jasper, for the dreams that had died, and for the uncertain future ahead. When her tears were spent, she washed her face in the basin provided and began to take stock of her situation. She was alive, she had shelter, at least temporarily, and she had met a man who, despite being practically a stranger, had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her husband had in years. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of activity outside the cabin. She dressed quickly in her cleanest remaining dress, of faded blue cotton that had seen better days, and stepped onto the porch to find Kieran unloading supplies from a wagon. "Good morning," he called, setting down a crate of provisions. "Hope I didn't wake you. Thought you might need some essentials." Margaret stared at the abundance before her sacks of flour and sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, even a few fresh vegetables, and a small crate of apples. "I can't accept all this." "It's not charity," Kieran said firmly. "Mr. Randall sends his regards and says to tell you that these are advance supplies against work you can do for the ranch." "What kind of work?" Margaret asked, suspicious. "Mrs. Fletcher could use help with the cooking and mending for the hands. And Mr. Randall's daughter Ellen is in need of someone to help with her studies. She's 12 and bright as they come, but Mrs. Fletcher's too busy to continue teaching her." Margaret had been a school teacher before her marriage, a fact she'd mentioned briefly the previous day. "I haven't taught in years." "But you could," Kieran said simply. "The pay is fair, and you can stay in this cabin as part of your compensation." It was more than Margaret had dared hope for. "When does Mr. Randall want to meet me?" "You're invited to Sunday dinner at the main house tomorrow," Kieran replied. "But there's no rush. He understands you've been through an ordeal." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I'll be there, and I'll earn my keep." Kieran nodded, approval in his eyes. Never doubted it for a moment. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into a routine at the Triple R. Mrs. Fletcher, a round-faced widow with capable hands and a no-nonsense demeanor, welcomed the extra help in the kitchen. Ellen Randall proved to be a delightful student, eager to learn and full of questions about the world beyond the ranch. Robert Randall himself was a revelation, a gray-haired gentleman with kind eyes and a commanding presence who treated everyone from the lowest ranch hand to visiting cattle buyers with equal respect. He welcomed Margaret warmly and made it clear that her presence was valued, not merely tolerated. "Kieran told me about your situation," he said during their first private conversation. "I want you to know that you're safe here for as long as you choose to stay." "Thank you," Margaret said, touched by his kindness. "I won't abuse your hospitality." "I've no fear of that," Mr. Randall replied with a smile. "Kieran's a good judge of character, always has been." Speaking of Kieran, Margaret found herself watching for him whenever she was outside the cabin. As foreman, he was often busy from dawn until dusk, but he made time to check on her every day, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, wild flowers he'd gathered on the range, or, once, a beautiful handmade leather journal. "Thought you might want to write down your thoughts," he said when he presented it to her. "Sometimes putting words on paper helps make sense of things." Margaret ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover. "Did it help you? After your wife and son?" Kieran's smile was tinged with sadness. "It did. Didn't bring them back, but it helped me find my way forward." As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Margaret found herself healing in ways she hadn't expected. The bitter anger toward Jasper began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of gratitude for her new circumstances. She still had difficult days when the magnitude of her husband's betrayal threatened to overwhelm her, but those days grew fewer as winter approached. One crisp November afternoon, Margaret was gathering the last of the garden vegetables when Kieran rode in, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned. "Jasper's back," he said without preamble. "In Cottonwood Springs. Heard about it from one of the hands who was in town this morning." Margaret's heart raced, but more from anger than fear. "Did he say what he wants?" "Apparently, he's claiming you stole money from him before he left. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you had savings hidden away that belonged to him." "That's ridiculous," Margaret said, indignation rising. "He took everything of value. The only thing he left behind was debt." Kieran's expression softened. "I know, but he's stirring up trouble, and I thought you should be prepared. There's also talk that the woman he left with abandoned him in Denver after he gambled away their traveling money." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "So he's come crawling back, thinking I'll take him in?" "Possibly." Kieran hesitated. "Or he might have heard you're working at the Triple R. The ranch has a good reputation, and he might think there's money to be had here." The thought of Jasper showing up at the ranch, attempting to claim her as his property along with any wages she'd earned, filled Margaret with cold dread. Under the law, a husband still had rights to his wife's property and earnings, a fact Jasper would certainly exploit. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to Kieran. "You could divorce him," Kieran suggested cautiously. "Colorado has more favorable laws than most territories when it comes to women's rights in divorce." "That takes time and money," Margaret said, wringing her hands. "And a lawyer. Jasper could show up here any day." Kieran was quiet for a moment, then said in a measured tone, "There is another option." When Margaret looked at him questioningly, he continued, "If you were to remarry, your new husband would have legal standing against Jasper's claims." Margaret stared at him, stunned. "Are you suggesting I find someone to marry me just to thwart Jasper?" "Not just anyone," Kieran said quietly, his green eyes serious. "Me." The shock of his proposal left Margaret speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "You can't be serious." "I am," Kieran insisted. "It would be a marriage of convenience, of course, to protect you legally. I would make no demands on you that you didn't welcome." Margaret's mind raced. But why would you do this? Tie yourself to a woman you barely know. Kieran looked away, his profile strong against the setting sun. I know enough. I know you're strong, kind, and determined. I know you deserve better than what life has handed you so far. He paused. And I know that in the months you've been here, I've come to care about your welfare more than I thought possible. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of gardening. Over the past months, she had grown to respect and admire Kieran. His quiet strength, unfailing kindness, and occasional flashes of dry humor had become a cornerstone of her new life. But marriage? I need time to think, she said finally. Kieran nodded, unsurprised. Of course, it's not a small thing I'm proposing. He mounted his horse. I'll be back tomorrow. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. That night, Margaret wrote in the journal Kieran had given her, pouring out her conflicted thoughts. Marriage to Kieran would protect her legally, but what kind of foundation was that for a life together? And yet, wasn't there more between them than mere convenience? The way her heart quickened when he appeared, the comfort she found in his presence, the growing trust between them, these weren't the feelings of someone merely grateful for rescue. By dawn, she had made her decision. When Kieran arrived mid-morning, she was waiting on the porch of the cabin. I've thought about your proposal, she said, without preamble as he dismounted. And? His face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his hat. I'll marry you, Margaret said, but not just for legal protection. She took a deep breath. These past months, you've shown me what a good man truly is. If we're to marry, I want it to be real, not just on paper. The hope that blazed in Kieran's eyes nearly took her breath away. Are you certain? I don't want you to feel obligated. I'm certain, Margaret said, surprising herself with how true it was. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you found me in the ashes of my old life. I just didn't recognize it until now. Kieran closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, taking her hands in his. Margaret Vance, I never thought I'd find love again after I lost my family. But you've brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever. His kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and Margaret responded with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally separated, both were breathless. How soon can we marry? Margaret asked, practicality reasserting itself. If Jasper is in town, we don't have much time. The circuit judge is due in Cottonwood Springs tomorrow, Kieran said. We could be married by noon if we ride out at first light. So soon? Margaret's eyes widened. Kieran's smile was teasing. Having second thoughts already? No, she assured him, squeezing his hands, just realizing how quickly life can change. They were married the next day in the judge's temporary office above the general store in Cottonwood Springs. Margaret wore her blue dress, freshly washed and mended, with wildflowers in her hair that Ellen Randall had helped arrange. Kieran wore his best shirt and a new vest, his hair neatly combed and his face cleanly shaven. Mr. Randall stood as witness, his approval evident in his beaming smile. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Kieran's kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would build together. Margaret felt a joy she had never known with Jasper, a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. They were leaving the general store, plans to celebrate with lunch at the hotel restaurant underway, when a familiar voice called out from across the street. Well, if it isn't my runaway wife. Jasper Vance stood swaying slightly in front of the saloon, his once handsome face now bloated and his clothes shabby. The months since his departure had not been kind to him. Margaret felt Kieran stiffen beside her, but his voice was calm when he spoke. She's not your wife anymore, Vance. She's mine now, legally and properly. Jasper's face contorted with rage. You can't just take what's mine, Lawson. I didn't take anything, Kieran replied evenly. You abandoned her, left her to die with no food, no horse, and a burned-out barn. A small crowd was gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Margaret stood tall beside Kieran, refusing to cower before the man who had caused her so much pain. She owes me money, Jasper insisted, his words slurring slightly. Hid it from me before I left. That's a lie, Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying to the onlookers. You gambled away everything we had. including our cattle and my mother's silver. You left me with nothing but debt and broken promises." Murmurs from the crowd indicated where their sympathies lay. Jasper had apparently made no friends during his return to town. "You've no claim on Margaret or anything she earns now," Kieran stated firmly. "The judge has the paperwork to prove it. So I suggest you move along before you make more of a spectacle of yourself than you already have." Jasper's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but Sheriff Taylor stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. "I wouldn't, Vance. Not unless you want to spend your wedding night in my jail." The fight seemed to drain out of Jasper as he realized he was outnumbered and outmatched. With a final venomous glare at Margaret and Kieran, he spat in the dirt and stalked back into the saloon. "Thank you, Sheriff," Kieran said with a nod of acknowledgement. "No need for thanks," the lawman replied. "Just keeping the peace." He tipped his hat to Margaret. "Congratulations, Mrs. Lawson. Seems you've traded up considerably." The incident with Jasper cast only a momentary shadow over their day. By the time they returned to the Triple R that evening, it felt like a distant memory compared to the reality of their new life together. Kieran had prepared a surprise. The guest cabin had been transformed with fresh curtains, new bedding, and vases of late autumn flowers. A wedding gift from the ranch hands and household staff sat on the table. A beautiful quilt that Mrs. Fletcher and the women had secretly made, featuring a pattern called Wedding Ring. "Welcome home," Kieran said softly as he carried Margaret over the threshold, a tradition she had missed in her first marriage. That night, as they lay together in the afterglow of lovemaking more tender and passionate than Margaret had ever experienced, Kieran traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he confessed. "After Sarah and the baby died, I closed off that part of myself. Didn't think I deserved happiness after failing to protect them." "You didn't fail," Margaret murmured, pressing a kiss to his palm. "Some things are beyond our control." "I know that now," Kieran said. "Meeting you, seeing how you faced your own losses with such courage, it helped me finally forgive myself." He pulled her closer. "I love you, Margaret Lawson. Not because you needed saving, but because you saved yourself. And in doing so, you saved me too." As winter gave way to spring, Margaret and Kieran's bond deepened. They worked side by side on the ranch, Kieran continuing as foreman, while Margaret divided her time between teaching Ellen, helping Mrs. Fletcher, and establishing a small school for the children of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. In late April, as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the plains, Margaret shared news that brought tears of joy to Kieran's eyes. She was expecting their child. "A fresh start," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat abdomen. "A new life from the ashes of our old ones." Jasper Vance left Colorado Territory that spring, moving on to try his luck in California after losing what little he had left in yet another card game. He was never heard from again in Cottonwood Springs, and as the years passed, even the memory of him faded from Margaret's mind, replaced by the joys and challenges of her new life. Their daughter, Sarah Ellen Lawson, was born on a crisp November day, almost exactly a year after they had married. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, a son joined the family, Robert James Lawson, named for the man who had given them both a second chance at the Triple R. When old Mr. Randall passed away peacefully in 1885, he left the Triple R to his daughter Ellen, with Kieran named as managing partner in recognition of his years of loyal service. The Lawson family built a new home on the ranch property, not far from where the guest cabin had stood, and Margaret's school grew to serve children from miles around. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together, Kieran took Margaret's hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, just as he had on their wedding night. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Marrying me so hastily?" Margaret smiled, the years having only enhanced her beauty in Kieran's eyes. "The only thing I regret is that we wasted so much time beforehand. I should have realized sooner what was growing between us." "We found each other exactly when we were meant to," Kieran replied, pulling her close. "And look what we've built from nothing." As the sun set over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret rested her head on her husband's shoulder and gave thanks for the fire that had destroyed her old life, clearing the way for something far more precious to grow in its place. From the ashes of abandonment had risen a love strong enough to weather any storm, a family bound by choice rather than obligation, and a future brighter than either of them had dared to dream possible when fate first brought them together on that dusty, desperate day so many years ago.